Hello and welcome to the final day of the Business Diversity Economic Expo. It may be the final, but it will definitely be the best. We're going to kick it off with just an incredible conversation. But first, an enormous thanks to all of our sponsors who've made this whole series work. Bruce Power, the City of Toronto, Power Corporation of Canada, Meridian Waste Connections of Canada, and our friends at Global Public Affairs. When it comes to diversifying supply chains, a lot of people think of it as a nice to have or take it up one notch. It's the right thing to do because we've got to be good in the community. But really at the heart of this is it's not only the right thing to do, it is economically the right thing to do. And no one has made the business case stronger. No one has done as much research into the impact of diversification of supply chains, the importance and the business case for diversity and inclusion than renowned researcher, Dr. Wendy Cukier, head of the Diversity Institute, the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub, and a key player in the Future Skills Center right at Ryerson University. She's joining us today in conversation with Murad Bahmani, not only a senior partner at MNP, but we're delighted at the Ontario Chamber of Commerce to have him as the chair of our board. Over to you, Murad.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to a conversation with Dr. Wendy Cukier of Ryerson University. I have the immense pleasure to spend a few moments with Wendy and understand her research and best practice and ideas that she can share with us regarding procurement, SME business, and the diversity. I am immensely proud to be associated with Ontario Chamber of Commerce for not only pivoting under these difficult times, but also living up to its mandate of being an indispensable partner of business in Ontario. I am also particularly happy with the Business Diversity Economic Expo that is being driven by the Ontario Chamber of Commerce, which is a great idea as the procurement officers and supply chain leaders sometimes look for opportunities to engage with diverse businesses. And this initiative is indeed a great step in that direction. I also want to acknowledge that this work would not be possible without partners who bring forward not only great ideas, but their resources and research. And in that context, we are speaking with Dr. Wendy Cukier regarding her work and her research and her best practices. Welcome, Dr. Wendy Cukier.
Thanks for having me.
So I feel and the crowd, the group and the audience would be very happy to hear your perspectives on this unique area, in the sense that sometimes the devil's in the detail, and the research that you and your team undertakes opens up perspectives that may not be visible. I would love to ask you if you could please share, based on your research, how can procurement be used as a strategic tool during the difficult times and the recovery phase?
Sure, thank you for the question. So we know that COVID has impacted all business generally, but it's had the most impact on the smallest businesses. We also know that diverse business owners, women, racialized business owners, Indigenous business owners have had an even harder time because they tend to be smaller in services sectors and less well-financed than larger small businesses. So it's a kind of a perfect storm for owners of SMEs, and we've certainly heard all of the details about the impacts on closures, on losing businesses, on losing business, on revenues down, on on companies barely holding on. And now more than ever, I think that we need to think not just about economic recovery, but also how we put our money where our mouth is when we talk about our commitments to diversity and inclusion. And so for me, procurement is something that can bring those two things together. The research is really strong to suggest that businesses and governments benefit from more diversity in their supply chains. Not only does it give them access to uh, innovation, new products, new services, but it positions them well for the changing environment where increasingly um, diversity practices are something that large customers are starting to look at. And we've seen procurement used to drive change in other sectors and in other countries. The United States has been using set-asides in procurement for many years in order to grow small businesses. Canada is a bit of a laggard in this space, and in Canada, the companies that tend to be leading in this area are the really big multinationals because they're accustomed to having to report on their procurement practices in places like the U.S., especially in certain sectors, or if they're doing work with the government and so on. So there's pretty solid evidence that this is good for the customer, the large companies, the government, and there's no doubt that it creates opportunity for smaller businesses who now more than ever need to expand their customer base. So I think that the business case for diversity in procurement is strong. The ethical case is strong, and increasingly it's going to be part of organizations' competitive advantage as we see even the Government of Canada, for example, launching its 50/30 challenge.
That's great. Thank you for those insights. I couldn't agree more with a lot of the comments you made. And you talked about some of the large organizations and initiatives that they are driving, including those that are in the US. Can you tell, based on your research, what are some of the things these large organizations, government and private sector, do with procurement and funding that present barriers to SME, particularly those owned by women and diverse groups?
Sure. Well, this is what I would say is that in my experience, it's not like there are deliberate practices to keep people out. It's just that with procurement, as with hiring, as with marketing, as with just about everything, organizations tend to do what they've always done, tend to work with who they've always worked with, tend to rely on the networks that they built over time. And as I said, many of the women-led businesses, many of the businesses led by newcomers or by Black entrepreneurs or Indigenous entrepreneurs are newer. They're not necessarily part of the networks that large corporations and governments typically turn to when they're looking for three quotes or when they're sending out an RFP. And I've even seen that in my own consulting practice where I'm just not on the list, and look at who is getting the contracts, and that you could have done the work just as well as they did, if not better. So that's one piece of it. It's making sure that your policies and your practices are open to new companies, to different companies, to companies that you haven't previously done work with. That's kind of the baseline. Companies that are progressive will set targets, and so will governments. And we have seen both at the federal and the municipal level, and even some provinces, set targets for diversity in their procurement. And those targets are clear. They're publicized, and they're understood within the organization. So that's also something that progressive companies do, and some companies don't think about. I mean, some companies will cite, concerns about reverse discrimination or human rights or other things because they're simply not informed. They don't understand that, in fact, not only is there a business case for diversity and procurement, but there's also plenty of room in our legal and regulatory frameworks to proceed. So sometimes it's that they don't know, they haven't thought about it, or they're accustomed to doing things the way they've always done them. I think that the other side of it is often companies will say, well, we have these targets, we're open, but there are none. So I think that's the other barrier is some companies do have the intention. They might even, and governments as well, they have the intention. They might even have the goals or the targets set, but they aren't being proactive to do the outreach and the capacity building that's often needed for women-led and diverse companies to do business with them. And anybody, for instance, who has done work with government or responded to RFPs or whatever, knows that it's a whole different world. It is a whole different world. And if you don't have experience in that world, it seems incredibly alien. So again, progressive organizations, governments that have been successful in doing this, have much more proactive approaches where they reach out to companies that potentially could be in their supply chain at some point. They run workshops. They help them understand how the RFP process operates and what is required in order to bid on a project. And those things are incredibly important because even I've been a consultant for, I don't know, over 30 years, I guess. And even I sometimes look at the requirements and, they want $1 million insurance. Well, I'm a sole proprietor. I don't bring in that much money. I'm not going to get insurance. I had a case recently where even through the university, there was a requirement for a certain level of security clearance to do a diversity assessment of a government department. Please explain to me what is the security risk
Right.
associated with doing a diversity assessment of a government department. So
Right.
sometimes companies and governments inadvertently put in requirements that if they really ask the question, is this necessary? They would not have, but it's what they have always done. And if they're dealing with large providers, if they're dealing with mainstream companies who they've been doing business with for many years, those organizations will have the insurance, will have the security clearance, will know that if a project is asking for impact assessment, they will know the language to use. They will know the things to count. They will know the claims to make. And I would actually say that government and large businesses sometimes also reward good proposal writing
Mhm.
than necessarily good ideas. And what I mean by that is that often if you're in the system, you understand the conventions. Once you've done one RFP for a client, it's pretty easy to do the next. And they often don't understand that those very processes can be incredibly daunting and intimidating. I've been really pleased to see certainly some government agencies really streamline their processes, simplify their forms, use two-stage processes where the first stage is to get the idea, and then once you're in the short list, you get more support in terms of information about what's required. Making sure that the calls for proposals or the RFPs that are posted are very specific about what is required in each section if indeed they're going to be very specific about how they evaluate them. Sometimes the criteria, if the criteria put a lot of emphasis on the number of years that an organization has been in business, or if to do work with a large company, you have to already have done work with a large company. You can get into a chicken and egg sort of problem. So it's really at every single stage of the process that there are often systemic barriers built in to things that may seem to the company or government to be reasonable and just the way they've always done business. And what I would say is, if you want to be inclusive, you have to challenge and question the way that you have always done business. Because if you just keep doing things the way you've always done business, you're going to always be doing business with the same people. And rather than taking advantage of the opportunities that women-led businesses and those led by Indigenous people, immigrants, and others bring to the table.
Right, right. Well, thank you for sharing those insights and some practical ways of addressing the issue. Because just changing the label on top to say we are open for diverse business and we have these quotas don't necessarily help, because the devil is indeed in the details and the execution of it, and the commitment has to be full. So very, very good insights you shared, Wendy. Um, what is needed to help small businesses improve their chances of winning a bid? If you can share some insights into that.
Well, one of the quickest ways I would say is partnering. And I just reflect on my own experience as a consultant. I got my start as a subcontractor to large companies. Now that wasn't under the banner of diversity and inclusion or anything else. It was just they needed specialized skills. I had specialized skills, and so by subcontracting with large corporations, clearly, as a little consultant, I could not compete with the Institute for the Future on a bid, or with KPMG on a bid, or with International Data Corporation on a bid. But I could bring something to the table that they valued. And for me, that was actually how I started to understand how these processes actually worked, how I started to build my networks, how I started to learn what the unwritten rules were around, putting in proposals, making sure you had at least a few diagrams in them, and use certain language. So I would actually say that my skills in developing proposals and in winning bids, which has really applied not just in traditional procurement of services, but also in some of the very large grants that we've been successful in securing, really came from that starting point, which was working with people who knew how to do it. So I think that's one strategy. I think, again, as I said, there are increasingly progressive organizations that are really genuinely committed to trying to develop diversity in their supply chain. And they will actually run workshops and seminars and preparatory events to explain what they're looking for. I think that those kinds of opportunities are really important to participate in, partly because then you start to develop the name brand recognition, and also because you'll start to learn what is required. I think in some instances, especially newcomers who really may have more challenges in terms of understanding the conventions, this may also be an issue with Indigenous small businesses. Sometimes you may need to hire a specialist to help you prepare, especially if it's a really big bid. Maybe you need to hire somebody to help you prepare it. And it's a cost of doing business, it's a potential risk, but it may increase your chances of being successful. I think as well, a lot of small businesses look at the hoops that you have to jump through. Look at the forms. Look at the the requirements, like some of the ones that I mentioned. The insurance requirements and so on, and those things discourage them. I do think that in the current environment, there is such goodwill and intention, at least, to open up supply chains that I think, like any other aspect of business, you have to be persistent. You have to know where to look. You have to be scanning. There are certain places where government is going to post opportunities. You have to subscribe to those and keep your eyes open. I think the other thing that's incredibly important and helpful is there are organizations, the Canadian Council of Aboriginal Business, um, uh, uh, the CAMC, We Connect, some of the ethnic chambers of commerce and so on, that really are also committed to helping to build capacity. And sometimes they will provide supports and training and so on in terms of navigating these difficult processes to get in. But I think that it is a huge opportunity. I think it can make a massive difference. And frankly, once you've broken in, once you've become part of the club that serves government or large corporations, it opens up ongoing opportunities to grow your business. And there's some places, if you're in healthcare and health tech, for instance, where understanding these processes can open up massive markets, not just in Canada, but internationally. So it is something that requires attention. It is something that requires a kind of orientation and attention to detail. The documents matter. What they ask for matters. If they ask for 5 things, give them the 5 things. Give them the 5 things in the order they ask them for. Make sure it's well written. Make sure it's easy to understand. Make sure it's proofread and laid out properly and complete. I've seen some cases where proposals from deserving organizations were not considered because they simply were not complete. They forgot to include a statement or a document. And I do think, and this is something that we're pushing very hard, the research shows really clearly that a lot of women-led businesses and a lot of businesses led by Indigenous people, as well as for example, businesses in the Black community, are sole proprietorships, or people are self-employed. They're not incorporated. They often don't have a lot of the formal requirements that will open doors, like insurance, and so on. And one of the things we're trying to do is really push more formalization in some of these companies, because it will open doors, not just in terms of opportunities for clients, but also in opportunities for getting access to grants to help you go global, to build capacity, to do R&D and so on. And so those are some of the things that really are important. There are definitely more opportunities for businesses that are incorporated than for businesses that are not. And what I would argue is it's better to be incorporated if you can, because it reduces risk. It creates more opportunities for you to use other people's money to grow your business. And it will also open up more opportunities for procurement and large customers.
Thank you, Wendy. Sage advice and really practical ones to execute on. A couple of takeaways from my perspective was that it is an area that is changing as the organizations are becoming more aware and active. So it's important to stay on top of the change. Number 2, there's an opportunity to collaborate or come as support for a party that is putting out a proposal, and see how you can complement that. And thirdly, there are organizations out there that are willing and committed to support this initiative and how best to align with them to better your chances for success. Um, Maybe you can talk a little bit about the opportunities and leading practices worldwide where procurement has been used as an instrument to advance the economy.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I mentioned some of them previously. I mean, the U.S. is sort of classic, although I do know people have done research that challenges some of the impact. Large corporations like Walmart, for instance, or Sodexo, big multinationals, have for a long time included procurement as part of their diversity strategy. Companies that are in the broadly defined electronics and technology industry often are signatories to various codes of conduct and so on that require them to set targets. We've certainly seen not just national governments, but particularly local governments use procurement as an important lever for economic development and equity. The City of Toronto, I think you've spoken to them, for example, is a kind of exemplar in that regard. We've seen more and more large corporations in Canada at least talk about diverse procurement, although I think in Canada, as I said, we're a bit farther behind in terms of how we execute. One of my favorite examples of driving change with procurement was Legal Leaders for Diversity, who were the legal counsels of large law firms. And they simply said, we're going to look at gender and diversity when we make decisions about corporate counsel hires. And this is something that's been an issue in the United States for many years, but simply hadn't gained traction in Canada. And it changed the behavior of Bay Street law firms much faster than any of the, good intentions and rainbow posters. So I've seen very concrete cases where it's been transformational. I mean, even at my own university recently, they've started to share a commitment around diversity in procurement, because when you think about the university purchases a lot of services from a lot of different organizations, whether it's technology or whether it's catering, and opening that up and being more intentional around creating opportunities for others is really important. I do think we have to grapple with the truth, though, that I'm old enough to remember when they used to say, no one ever got fired for buying IBM. And the point was that with disruptive technologies in particular, often there are new companies, we might think of Apple, that are on the horizon, the up and comers. But there is risk associated with investing in some of these smaller companies with less of a track record. And for many years, that was one of the things that helped big companies like IBM hang on to their market share, because large corporations were risk adverse with respect to their technological infrastructure. And one can understand why. So one of the things that I think is really interesting is some large corporations have created almost skunk works or incubators where they nurture some of these smaller companies, where they provide them opportunities to have projects that will not take down the corporate network. And I think about one of the companies that we incubated at Ryerson, and I was chair of the board for a while when I was the VPRI, called Flybits. Flybits got its start. It was started by a professor, and it got its start because it was able to get contracts with Metrolinx and with the City of Ottawa to test its context-aware computing. It was something that wasn't going to take down their networks. It was kind of an added value. And Flybits recently got $30 million investment. It's just such a great case study of how public dollars early in the process and investments by a couple of large financial institutions gave this little company with leading edge technology a break. And now it's on its way to being a much bigger company. So, you have to be a bit patient. You have to have the capacity to assume a certain level of risk in some sectors. Walmart deciding to put a new product on its shelves is not as risky as a bank or a large organization deciding to embed some new technology into their infrastructure. So we have to be realistic about what's possible and what's reasonable and how we protect the interests of both the supplier and the customer. But I think there's some really good examples that we could better exploit and we need to exploit, particularly in the time of COVID.
Great, thank you. Yeah, once you are committed to this initiative, indeed, there are examples and best practices out there. One needs to just look out. The next question I have is an important one because the tone that gets set with large organizations and government agencies is quite critical. And we always talk about recognizing diversity, but then the real work happens when you try to work on the actual effort of including or inclusion initiatives. Can you give some advice as to the government agencies and large employers who are looking to advance the diversity and inclusion using procurement in terms of how to go about that?
Sure. Well, I think I've talked a lot about this. I've talked a lot because I'm a professor. That's But I think that, what is really important is to go beyond the targets. The targets are good. The targets can be meaningful, but the targets are only words on paper if you haven't actually thought through your implementation process. And we actually are bringing someone from the federal government on secondment to the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub and the Diversity Institute for a couple of years to specifically help build capacity in small businesses to do business with government and help coach them and help them understand in a real way what is required. I've already talked about the great work that some of the organizations like CAMC and others do. And I think that what the government really has to do is engage with some of those organizations to not just post their targets, but meet their targets. And that's where the heavy lifting comes in. And I would say the same thing. I mean, we have a lot of large corporations who are standing up and saying we support Black North, or standing up and saying we support reconciliation, or standing up and saying, yes, women are great. But when you start to actually look at their actions rather than just their words, there are often some really big gaps. So, we have for years worked with organizations on doing diversity assessments, looking at what their policies and processes are, even digging into the language, the forms, the outreach approaches, the selection criteria, and so on, because that's often where the barriers exist. And it's like any other strategy. You need the targets, you need the implementation plan, and you need the accountability framework so you can be sure what you're doing is actually producing the results that you hope to achieve.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Wendy, for your insightful comments and sharing the depth in the research that you've undertaken. I find for the viewers also that there are interesting bits of nuggets, not only talking about the research or just high-level stats, but more actionable items and examples of best practices. So I truly appreciate you being generous with your time, your knowledge, and your insight with our audience, and your ongoing support in this meaningful initiative. Thank you so much, Wendy.
And thank you to the OCC, because it is an organization that, in my view, is leading the way on advocating for some of these practices. And I was thrilled to see procurement as one of the levers that was being identified in the she-covery strategy, for example. So thank you for the work that you do, because I think it's really impactful.
Thank you, Wendy.
Wow, what a great discussion. What a great expo. Make sure to get out there and see all of these incredible businesses. And again, from the bottom of our hearts, a big, big thank you, not just to all the participants and all of the attendees, but to our incredibly generous sponsors who've made this possible. Bruce Power, Power Corporation of Canada, the City of Toronto, Meridian, Waste Connections of Canada, and our friends at Global Public Affairs.